Hello, friends. I'm glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a housing association that disconnected the power to my house. Growing up, I always heard stories about our lake house. My grandfather Wilton had been among the first in the region to secure a permit back when only 3 to 5 licenses were granted for private lakefront homes. Everyone else in the vicinity competed for a chance to live right on the water. But thanks to a combination of good timing, wise negotiation, and maybe even a bit of luck, Grandfather Wilton managed to lock down the final permit. He built a cozy log structure, complete with a stone chimney and a small deck that extended right to the shore. Over the decades, almost all of those neighboring lake houses deteriorated or were demolished, but ours remained standing, though in desperate need of maintenance. That was largely because my grandfather and later my dad dedicated themselves to its upkeep. From the time I could walk, I found peace at that property. Summers were spent splashing around in a rowboat or tossing pebbles into the water from the unstable dock. Winters meant tucking ourselves indoors, playing board games by the glow of the fireplace, occasionally daring to step outside to watch the snow blanket the frozen lake. I always felt like the luckiest kid in the world. Most of my friends from school had never even seen a private lake house up close, and sometimes I'd sneak them in to roast marshmallows or dangle their feet off the dock. It wasn't a place of extravagance. The structure was sturdy but modest, and despite its tremendous sentimental value, it never had the glamorous look many associate with modern lakefront mansions. When my grandfather passed, my father took over responsibility for the house. But as the years went by, my parents moved for work, then retirement, and eventually I inherited the property. I knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. I had spent my entire childhood daydreaming about living in that rustic cabin for good, transforming it into a comfortable year-round dwelling. My father granted me that dream in his will. So after carefully saving up for renovations, I sold my suburban condo and settled permanently in the lake house. That decision placed me straight into the center of a local controversy I didn't see coming. There's this local homeowners association that claims jurisdiction over our entire area, including the roads leading to the lake. Their rules, in theory, are meant to maintain property values, keep the roads plowed in winter, and handle neighborhood cleanliness. But I learned the hard way that certain board members wield their influence like a personal weapon. I had little idea what I was in for until the day I hosted a simple housewarming gathering for a couple of friends. Only about 5 people came, all from out of town. We grilled some burgers, enjoyed the view, and had a quiet celebration. That night, I discovered a passive-aggressive note taped to my door. Next time you have guests over, kindly inform the community so we can coordinate. This property is part of the HOA, and compliance with events is required. I remember reading the note at least 3 times, convinced I was misunderstanding it. Events compliance? Required for having a personal gathering at my own house? Initially, I laughed. That had to be a silly misunderstanding. I was certain I had never joined the HOA, at least not formally. I wasn't even aware that the lake house had been bound by any such agreement. My grandfather's permit was older than the HOA's entire existence. I decided to ignore the note for the time being, figuring it would resolve itself. Once I explained to whoever left it that historically, the property had never been subject to their association. Just a few days later, I got another note, this time on official letterhead. We'd like to confirm your property for the next Community Lake Day. The letter went on to describe how every summer, residents gather for a day of barbecues, boat rides, and family events by the water. In prior years, they used a public beach near the dam, but according to them, now that we have an inhabitable lake house within our association boundaries, we can relocate the festivities to a cozier setting, your place. My blood pressure shot up. I was stunned by their assumption that they could just announce an event in my backyard. I had never heard from them before, never paid dues, never been part of their community events. Sure, I want to be a good neighbor, but to them, it was more like I had no choice in the matter. I decided it was time to speak to someone face to face. I walked to the HOA office, a small building near the entrance to our neighborhood, where a woman named Dahlia greeted me. I explained that I had inherited the property from my grandfather, that I had never signed up for membership, and that I certainly never gave permission for big events at my home. Dahlia listened patiently, nodded, offered me a cookie from a plastic container on her desk, and then said that is sweet dear, but the board voted that all properties in the area must abide by the HOA rules, including lakefront sites. You cannot choose to be outside of it, especially if it is a single-family home along the roads we maintain. I tried not to lose my cool. Instead, I asked for a copy of the contract that tied my house to this association. She disappeared into a back room, rummaged through a filing cabinet, and returned with a thick folder that apparently belonged to a man named Lionel, who had lived around the corner. She frowned and admitted she did not have the records for my place, but she added that it was just in the older files, and they would find it eventually. She said they have authority to impose guidelines on all homes there since the 1980s. That raised an eyebrow for me. My grandfather's permit and the original property deed dated back nearly 8 decades, well before the 1980s. I was pretty certain any attempt to fold my land into a newly created HOA would require a contract or something specific, which we never had. I thanked her and left, feeling uneasy but hopeful that logic would prevail. After all, there was no way they could force me to open my home for the neighborhood if I had never joined. About a week passed, and another letter arrived in my mailbox. This one accused me of failure to comply with community requests. It threatened fines, stating that I was in violation of Section 12, Clause 3, with the possibility of further action if I continued to resist. Resentment boiled up inside me. Who did these people think they were? Instead of paying any so-called fine, I prepared a carefully worded letter explaining that I did not and never had agreed to the association. I included photocopies of the original deed, referencing my grandfather's permit status and stating that the property was established well before the HOA's existence. Your claims of authority over this land are not valid, and I expect no further threats about my private property. That is when petty turned into downright malicious. Early one morning, I was enjoying coffee on the deck when my neighbor Gideon ambled over. He's a chatty guy who has lived down the road for decades. He told me some rumors flying around about how I was destroying the neighborhood spirit by refusing to host social gatherings. He also mentioned that the HOA president, an individual named Maribel, was extremely upset that I would not budge. Maribel had apparently told people that I owed it to the neighborhood to share the lakeshore. I recall Gideon shaking his head, telling me they're out for blood. Do not be surprised if they pull something, especially if they find a legal loophole. I try not to let it get to me, but sure enough, I learned just how vindictive they could be. 2 weeks after that conversation with Gideon, during an unseasonably hot afternoon, I noticed the air conditioning had shut off. Then I realized the lights would not come on. The entire house had lost power. My first assumption was a simple outage. The region occasionally faces blackouts when the local grid gets overloaded. I waited an hour, but saw no utility trucks passing on the road. I checked my phone for notifications from the electric company, but had nothing. Eventually, I walked out to the main breaker panel at the property's edge, only to discover a bright red padlock on it. A note was pinned right below, stating that due to repeated non-compliance, my property's electricity had been suspended. Restore your standing with the community to resume service. I stood there dumbfounded. This was blatant sabotage. Our utility lines run through local infrastructure that the HOA apparently helps fund, but they have no legal right to just disconnect me. The note's message was basically blackmail. If you do not host our events, we will make life impossible for you. I remember my heart pounding in my chest as I walked around the house, making sure there was no other explanation. But there it was, a brand new lock that clearly did not belong to the power company. I called the electric company's emergency line to confirm. Their representative told me there were no outages in my area and that my account was in good standing. They insisted they never sent anyone out. I asked if a private party could tamper with the supply and was told that it would be highly illegal. That was all I needed to hear. I rang a locksmith friend in a town about 30 minutes away. He came by that afternoon, took one look at the padlock, and said this is definitely not a standard utility lock. I can snap it off, but let us be careful to note everything in writing. This is evidence. I took pictures, recorded video, and documented everything. After we got rid of the lock, he checked the breaker. Sure enough, it had been manually switched off. He turned it back on, and the house lit up again. My next call was to a local attorney, someone I had used in the past for a small real estate purchase. She was appalled by the HOA's behavior and assured me that under no circumstances could they do such a thing legally. Even if I were part of the HOA, they would typically have to go through a court to impose a lien or a financial penalty if I refused to pay dues. Physically disconnecting power without my consent was beyond the pale. So, at her advice, I filed a police report for trespassing and tampering with utilities. Then I put in a call to a civil litigation lawyer she recommended. The next day, I also had a property boundary survey done just to double-check that the small strip of land with the electrical meter was indeed mine and not under HOA ownership. It was mine, confirmed. For about a month, I continued living as usual, though I upgraded some of my security cameras. I half expected them to try other stunts, maybe shutting off my water or blocking my driveway. The HOA's letters kept coming, each one more ridiculous than the last. One threatened that if I did not open my home for their fall harvest picnic, they would withhold community services. Another said that if I were a good neighbor, I would share my privilege. Mind you, I still was not even listed on their membership rolls. They had no official documents to prove I was under their jurisdiction. I deduced they simply wanted to bully me into compliance. The biggest bombshell came when I attended a private mediation session with the HOA board. My lawyer had arranged it, hoping we could settle the dispute without going to court. There were about 6 board members present, led by Maribel. The entire time, they tried to twist the narrative into me being a freeloader who benefited from living in a well-maintained neighborhood while refusing to pay dues or follow the rules. My attorney calmly asked them to produce any documentation that my property was part of their association. They did not have anything. They started referencing new developments in the area from the 1980s. She countered by showing them my grandfather's original permit from over 80 years ago. Their frustration was obvious. Finally, Maribel made a desperate argument. Even if the original property was not under the HOA, you made external renovations which we regulate. My lawyer asked them to show official building codes or permit applications that required going through the HOA. They had none. It grew heated, especially when I brought up the unlawful power disconnection. I showed them pictures of the lock, the note, everything. They tried to deny involvement. One board member muttered, "That is not an official HOA lock," while another insisted we never authorized shutting your power off. Maybe your electrician messed up. My lawyer reminded them that we had filed a police report and that if I proceeded, there would likely be subpoenas for the board members to appear in court. In the end, the mediation was a dead end, but I left feeling vindicated. It was clear I had a solid case if we went to court, and that is precisely what happened. When we could not come to an agreement, I pressed forward with a lawsuit. The suit alleged trespassing, illegal utility tampering, and harassment. I wanted them to formally acknowledge that my land was never and would never be under their authority. I also sought damages for the stress, the expenses, and the time off work I had to take to deal with this nonsense. My lawyer was confident we would win, and maybe even recoup costs. While the legal process in the United States can be notoriously slow, we were able to schedule a hearing relatively quickly, presumably because it was not an overly complicated land dispute, but rather an argument about an invalid attempt to forcibly subject a property to HOA rules. In that time, the harassment continued, but in subtler ways. Some neighbors who were apparently in Maribel's inner circle would leave their cars parked near my driveway entrance, forcing me to navigate awkwardly around them. One family tried to have a yard sale on my property line, setting up tables half on my grass. When I asked them to move, they claimed we have permission from the HOA. I threatened to call the police. They packed up but spat out some nasty remarks about me being anti-community. A separate plot line in this saga involved a local historian named Catalina. She was working on a piece about the original families who settled around the lake. She reached out to me because she had heard about my grandfather's involvement and the original building permits. Catalina had read about the heated friction with the HOA and wanted my perspective. She was surprised but not entirely shocked that a modern HOA was trying to take control of a historically private property. Through her research, she found old newspaper clippings praising my grandfather for preserving the lake's natural beauty. She even discovered an archive of letters referencing how he explicitly turned down an offer to join a neighborhood association decades ago. long before this particular HOA formed, because he felt it was a step toward reducing the land's authenticity. Catalina ended up testifying in court, sharing the historical context that the property was always separate. The day the trial finally arrived, I was both anxious and strangely excited to have it all come to a head. My lawyer presented the evidence methodically. The original deed, the permit, pictures of the lock, testimonies confirming the house predated the HOA by decades. Meanwhile, the HOA's attorney tried to argue that the roads leading to my house were maintained by the association, so that should grant them some measure of authority. But we had county records proving that the road was actually a county-maintained road. The HOA only handled the smaller side roads, not used for direct access to the lake house. This dismantled a major part of their argument. They claimed I gained unjust enrichment from certain shared community improvements, like newly installed streetlights. But my lawyer pointed out that those streetlights were paid for by the county after a local initiative. The HOA's attorney tried to argue that the power lines were owned or partially managed by the HOA, but the actual records from the electric company showed that the lines in service were operated under a public utility contract. The HOA had no rightful claim to them. Finally, the judge hammered them on the power disconnection incident. She looked distinctly unimpressed as the board members squirmed. There was no justification for their meddling with my electricity, and even their own counsel had to concede that whoever placed that lock did so without the board's official knowledge. It sounded hollow. After what felt like a marathon session, the court decisively ruled in my favor. Not only did the judge declare that my house was not under the HOA's governance, but she also found that the HOA's actions amounted to harassment. While evidence was mostly circumstantial regarding who physically placed the lock, the judge cited the repeated threatening notices and the board's overall attempts to force compliance. The ruling granted me a modest financial award, enough to cover my legal fees plus a bit extra for my trouble. It was not a staggering sum, but it was the principle that mattered. The judge also authorized a restraining order preventing the HOA from interfering with my property in any way without going through the court. The aftermath was just as dramatic. The HOA president, Maribel, stepped down from her position within a month. Rumors in the neighborhood suggested that the other board members blamed her for steering them into a losing lawsuit. Dahlia, the woman who worked at the HOA office, stopped by my house one afternoon and apologized, claiming she had just been following orders. She offered me a homemade pie as a peace offering. It was a bit awkward. I accepted the pie, but politely refused to let her see inside my home. I had enough community gatherings for a lifetime. She did mention that there were calls from other neighbors to remove more board members who had gone along with Maribel's vengeful actions. Meanwhile, Gideon, ever the friendly, chatty neighbor, filled me in on all the local gossip. He told me how the board tried to spin the court loss by saying the judge was biased or did not understand the complexities. But Gideon said the neighbors were not buying it anymore. Some folks who had supported the HOA realized how extreme and petty its leadership had become, especially after the truth about the utility tampering came out. People were afraid that if the board got away with it at my house, it could happen to anyone who dared to question them. Interestingly, Catalina's historical research ended up being significant beyond the trial. She organized a small event held at a local community center, not at my house, to showcase the origins of the lake area, including photos of the old properties and the few families who had built their homes there under those rare permits. I was invited as a guest of honor. It was quite a pleasant day. I gave a short speech, thanking everyone for preserving the memories of my grandfather and the others who had lived and loved the lake. The overwhelming sentiment from the crowd was gratitude that the place still existed in some semblance of its original form. With the threat of the HOA pushing me around effectively neutralized, I could finally focus on improving the house. I undertook a few renovations, refinishing the hardwood floors, updating the plumbing, and replacing the aging windows. A side story happened during the time I was arranging these renovations. An acquaintance named Quincy, who works in home restoration, asked if he could film a short segment about my property for a local history and renovation show. Initially, I was excited to showcase the house's character, but soon enough, the idea made me nervous because it might attract more attention from the same people who thought they had a right to come onto my property whenever they wanted. I ended up politely declining, stating I had enough drama with strangers. Quincy respected my decision. Despite the legal resolution, I did have a couple more minor run-ins with die-hard supporters of the old HOA board. One day, I caught a neighbor attempting to fish off my dock without asking. Now, I am generally happy for people to fish if they are respectful, but this gentleman, Trent, had been part of the group that publicly blamed me for ruining the community spirit. When I approached him, he started ranting about how the lake is for everyone in the neighborhood. He tried to argue that he had the right to fish from any point on the shore. I reminded him that my dock was on private property. If he wanted to float out on the lake from the public ramp, he was welcome, but stepping onto my dock was trespassing. He continued to rant, so I called out for him to leave immediately or face charges. He huffed, reeled in his line, and stomped off while muttering that the HOA had the right idea. Another plot line involved a younger couple, Presley and B, who moved in a few houses away. They had heard all about the drama, but had never been present for it themselves. They approached me at the mailbox one morning, introduced themselves, and politely asked if I would ever consider letting them hold a small wedding ceremony on the lawn right by the lake. They offered to pay a rental fee, sign any waivers, and keep the guest list under 50 people. Their pitch was incredibly courteous, acknowledging that it might be an imposition. It was a stark contrast to the HOA's bullying approach. Honestly, a small wedding for a sweet, respectful couple sounded kind of nice. But after everything I had been through, I was wary. I told them I would think about it. They left me their phone number and said they understood if I declined. After a few days, I decided I could let them use the space, provided we had a detailed written agreement that spelled out the date, the time, the number of guests, and the scope of their setup, including tents and chairs. Plus, a solid deposit to cover any potential damage. I was not out to be mean, but I also needed to protect my property. We had a meeting at my dining table, hammered out the agreement, shook hands, and parted ways on great terms. A month later, they held a simple, charming ceremony under a canopy of oak trees. The bride walked down a small aisle, the sun shimmered on the water, and for once, the presence of neighbors on my property felt wholesome, not forced. It was a delicate reminder that I was never against sharing the beauty of the lake. I only wanted it to be my choice to share, not forced upon me by some power-hungry organization.